Looks like some participants are starting to flow in. Welcome. Please feel free to type into the chat where you're coming from. We're gonna let the room populate a little bit, and then we're gonna get started with our next segment in our agroforestry series. See our number growing up to 17. That's pretty good. We have a few registrants today, I think up to 50. So we'll wait for a few minutes and then we'll get started. There's always one brave soul who types in the chat first of where they're logging in from. Who's it going to be today? And is chat working, hopefully? There we go. Lucas from the Delta Institute in Chicago. Thank you, Lucas. Chat is up and working. Hello. Hello from Oslo. Omar. Eric Ness from Lake County. Thanks for joining. We'll just give it about another minute here and then we'll get started. Thank you, Jamie. Vancouver, British Columbia. Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Josh Zuckerman. I'm coming from the Delta Institute here in Chicago. I'll be hosting today and I'll be introducing everyone in our group as we start moving forward. So today our agroforestry series is on agroforestry for conservation. This is the fourth in a series of, I believe, 10 that we're doing. I could be wrong on that number, forgive me if I am, but here we go, we'll get started. Nathan from the Liberty Prairie Foundation is going to introduce himself next.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Nathan Aaberg from the Liberty Prairie Foundation. Great to be joining with you. We are a small nonprofit in Grays Lake, Illinois. We promote ways of interacting with nature that are good for people and nature. Our particular focus is sustainable agriculture. We also operate the Northeast Illinois FarmLink program that you can find at illinoisfarmlink.org. Great to be here.
Thank you, Nathan. So again, Josh Zuckerman from the Delta Institute. Delta Institute is a Chicago-based nonprofit. We focus in sustainability projects throughout the Midwest. I'm the lead of our resilient agriculture portfolio. We are currently focusing on finding economic drivers and institutionalizing soil health management systems, which brings us to a partner of this great project with the Savanna Institute and Liberty Prairie Foundation. Katie's up next to introduce the Savanna Institute.
Hi, everyone. Katie Adams from the Savanna Institute. I'm based in Urbana and work broadly throughout Illinois with our demonstration farm network, as well as connecting folks to resources in agroforestry. And we're excited to partner with the Delta Institute and the Liberty Prairie Foundation on this project focused on agroforestry in partnership with the EPA for conservation and water quality. The Savanna Institute is based in central Illinois and central Wisconsin. And we're really focused on laying the groundwork for widespread agroforestry adoption. So our work includes research, outreach, and education, where we try to meet folks where they are, both in the field and in their process of adopting trees onto their landscapes.
Thank you, Katie. Then we're going to switch over to Lucas, who's going to do a couple polls for us.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to launch 3 polls. We want to hear from you. The first poll here, oh, you know what? Let me make sure. First poll that hopefully you can see on your screen is asking, which of the following best represents your role in agriculture? So we'd like to hear from you. We'll give it a few seconds here. I see on my screen the answers populating. Oh, okay. The results are in. I will share them here. Looks like we have a nice bell curve. So excellent. Lots of farmers, landowners, government agents, nonprofits, and other. Okay. So our next question is, why are you here? Good question. Let me, grab that here. I will launch that now. So which of the following of these best represents why you're joining us today? Are you just curious about agroforestry? Are you trying to help advise farmers or landowners that you work with? You want to learn how to implement agroforestry on your farm? Would you like to connect with Maayan or Omar? All right, I will give it 1 or 2 more seconds here. And the results are in. Looks like we have lots of curious people, and that is great. But a good share of the others. All right, so we have one more poll here that I will share with you in 1 second after I pull it up. So the question is, what are your top conservation goals? And you can choose 3 here. Any of those 3 of soil health, water quality, wildlife, pollinator support, interested in carbon sequestration or preventing soil erosion. Results are coming in. And I will share those results here. Great. Excellent. Well, with that, I will stop sharing, and I'm going to give the thank you, everyone. I'm going to give the presentation back to Katie. Thank you for participating in that.
It was great to see what everyone's top conservation goals are. It seems like soil health, water quality, and wildlife are our top ones. And it's a really exciting thing to think through because agroforestry can be one approach to helping meet all of these conservation goals. So when I say the word agroforestry, I'm really talking about an integrated approach that brings trees together with agricultural systems. So those can be annual cropping systems like grain rotations or vegetable production or specialty crop production. It can be the integration of livestock with trees, or it could be the combination of lots of different production systems all on one landscape. And we know when we add trees to these systems, and this is something that Maayan and Omar, our presenters, are going to talk more about, that we can have a lot of environmental outcomes as well as the profitable ones. So soil health, water quality, wildlife support are definitely at the top of the list, but trees can do a lot more. They can prevent erosion, they can improve comfort for livestock, they can even capture fertilizer and pesticides. This is one reason the EPA is interested in supporting work in agroforestry. So agroforestry is a pretty big term, and it means a lot of different things for folks here in the United States and around the world. But here in the US, at the Savanna Institute, we focus a lot on the main practices that are recognized by the USDA. And so I'm just going to quickly give a primer. If you want to learn more about these practices, we have a great Agroforestry 101 webinar. But the first practice we work with is alley cropping, which is the cultivation of crops among rows or groupings of trees or shrubs in a planned intentional system. A second practice is silvopasture, which is the intentional integration of trees and pasture and livestock. So that can be what we sometimes refer to as silvopasture by addition, where we're planting trees into pastures for soil health and livestock health, or it could be silvopasture by extraction, where we're looking at wooded areas where we're increasing biodiversity, we're increasing health of those woodlands by running animals through in a planned, intentional, and intensive way. A third practice that's supported by the USDA are riparian buffers, and these are particularly important when thinking about water quality and nutrient loss production, because the planting of trees and shrubs and perennial roots along streams or lakes or wetlands, anywhere where we can protect water using the strength of trees, their roots, and their canopies. A fourth practice is windbreaks, something we saw broadly across the Midwest and the Plains, but we see less of these days, which we're hoping to change more of that. And that's the planting of trees and shrubs and woodies alongside agricultural production to help enhance crop and livestock production through the protection of wind, the protection from drift, as well as wildlife and pollinator support. And then the last practice that we don't see very much here in Central Illinois, but is broadly practiced, across the United States in wooded areas is forest farming, which is the cultivation of specialty crops under existing canopies. So growing things like mushrooms or medicinals like ginseng within those systems. And with that primer, I'm going to get out of the way and let our amazing speakers take the reins. And I'm really excited to welcome Maayan and Omar today, who are going to be talking more in depth about the role of agroforestry and how trees can play a vital role in helping farmers and landowners reach their conservation goals. So Maayan Kreitzman is an interdisciplinary scientist whose work is focused on perennial cropping systems, and she's going to be walking us through research that her and her team conducted on Midwestern farms, and specifically looking at ways that agroforestry and perennial cropping systems can enhance biodiversity and ecosystem function. Oops, sorry, I accidentally advanced that a little too early. And then following Maayan, we're going to hear from Omar, who is a technical service provider here at the Savanna Institute that is working with clients in Illinois and the greater Midwest. And Omar is currently working with a land trust to incorporate agroforestry in their conservation and land restoration goals. So Omar is going to walk us through an InDesign process that focuses on long-term successional planning for both conservation and profit generation. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Thank you so much for being here, man. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Katie, for that great introduction. Okay, so I should have requested control here. Does that mean I can? Oh, there we go. Okay, I can cycle through now. Great, thank you, Katie. I'm really thrilled to be here. So just a bit more about me. I did my PhD on perennial agricultural systems, and I'm continuing with that work in my postdoc here in Vancouver at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. I'm going to share with you some of the, I think, most significant results from my PhD research, which was done in collaboration with the Savanna Institute in the Midwest. And that's me on a date plantation. So I wanted to know in this research, can perennial crops be grown effectively in diverse systems, and do they produce environmental benefits? The kinds of benefits that ecological theory said that they should. Specifically, I was curious about if perennial polycultures affect biodiversity indicators and ecosystem functions compared to adjacent cropland that's being managed conventionally in the US Midwest, and what are the yields of food from these systems, and also how do these perennial polycultures change over time. So when I say perennial polycultures, what does that mean, and how does it relate to agroforestry and what Katie was just introducing? So basically the systems we looked at were mostly alley crop systems, but they are a little bit more complicated in that they had more than one type of tree or shrub producing fruit and nuts, with hay or just mowed grass in the alleys, and some of them also included animals grazing. A few of the sites were planted in clumps rather than rows, and so in this work, I call these systems woody perennial polycultures rather than just alley crops, because they're systems where the primary product are fruit and nuts rather than a more simplified alley cropping system that uses timber and annual row crops, for example. So if I say perennial polyculture, it's not meant to confuse anyone, but it's just what I've gotten used to saying for this work. But I'm talking about basically an alley crop system that's primarily focused on fruit and nuts. So for the field study that I conducted, I visited 14 farms in 4 states, visited each farm twice over the spring and summer of 2018. And the criteria for selecting farms are basically that where there were 2 or more woody perennial crops for food being grown on a commercial scale with a neighboring field under conventional management, which meant corn, soy, or hay. And the perennial plantings range from 2 to 25 years old, with only 2 of them really being mature at over 20 years old. So the strength of this study really is that it used 14 sites with paired comparisons at each one, which gave us some statistical power. There really aren't a lot of studies, especially in the temperate north, that look at multiple ecological indicators for agroforestry style crop production. There's lots of studies on other agroforestry practices, but not that many on systems where the perennial food crops are the main product. So I'm going to jump right into results. I don't have much time to talk about methods, but you're welcome to ask me. So in terms of biodiversity, perhaps expectedly, we saw more diversity of plants, insects, and birds on the perennial sites compared to the conventional sites. So for example, for plants, you can see here on the left that we saw more richness, i.e. a higher number of species of plants on perennial polyculture sites than on hay, corn, or soy sites. And just so to help you read these graphs, the individual dots are individual sampling points, and then the black dot and the error bars are the model estimates and 95% confidence intervals. And if you see one of these blue bars, that means that it's a significant, statistically significant difference. We also saw that number of plants on the fields increased over time because we were able to do a regression with some fields of different ages, some perennial fields of different ages, which was interesting. And there were a higher number of species of plants, but also the types of plants that appeared on these different kinds of fields were different. So on this ordination plot, you can see that the communities of corn and soy field plants were kind of distinctive from the hay and perennial plant communities, which overlapped much more. For insects, I won't go into all the details, but basically we collected arthropods in a few different methods: pan traps, pit traps, and sweep nets, in order to capture diversity in different sort of layers of the vegetation. And you can see that the perennial sites generally had higher diversity than most of the other cover types, although that varied according to what trapping method was used. And we also divided the insects into different functional categories according to what those insects ate in a very sort of laborious classification process. And I'll share some of the results of that with you when I talk about ecosystem functions in a minute. For birds, we saw a really clear advantage in diversity here between, in this graph, all the comparison sites, the hay, corn, and soy are grouped together, and you can see that young perennial and mature perennial have been separated out, because my collaborator that led this work, Carl Deister, noticed that there was also like a difference between younger perennials and mature perennials. But there was quite an important difference there. We also did some DNA sequencing and looked at the soil microbiome. And what was interesting in the soil microbiome was that in terms of both species diversity and just amounts of bacteria and fungi, there were no differences. But when we looked at the beta diversity, or distribution of fungi, we saw that as you can see on the right, you can see that there, like in the plants, there are sort of distinct communities of fungi living in these perennial plots, which are in red, and the hay is in green compared to the blue and purple, which is the corn and soy. So there's differences in the communities, even if we're not seeing huge differences in the magnitudes or sort of like the number of unique sequences, which are the approximation of species. And we didn't see that difference with the bacteria. So that was quite interesting. And it accords with information from the literature about how some kinds of especially useful mycorrhizal fungi are quite sensitive to plowing and to soil disturbance. In terms of ecosystem functions, we looked at things that could potentially manifest as services or benefits to people. So we looked at soil properties, ground cover, and functions mediated by insects. And I do want to be careful in saying that we didn't directly measure benefits. We didn't measure ecosystem services per se, because I wasn't able to measure like insect damage or actual pollination visits, or those direct impacts. But we have some proxies that are based on the data that we collected that I'll share with you. So for soil properties, we looked at bulk density and saw that perennial sites had generally lower bulk density than the other two, especially in the top 15 centimeters of the soil. And this is agronomically significant because of compaction, the issues that compaction causes with smaller pore size, decreased hydraulic conductivity, and nutrient availability, as well as the effects of erosive washing out of soils when they're really compacted and can't absorb. We also looked at ground cover, so just vegetative ground cover, and you can see that the perennial plantings had higher vegetative ground cover, as you would expect, compared to corn and soy fields. So that's directly linked to nutrient pollution and runoff issues and erosion issues. One of the weaknesses of the study is that I didn't conduct direct measurements of nutrient runoff, water retention, etc. But this is kind of functioning as a proxy for those things. We also looked at soil fertility, and you can see here that in the top layer of soil, the perennial sites had higher nitrogen than hay and soy fields, and that there was no real difference in the available phosphorus. And for the deeper layer of soil, I didn't show this because it's just too busy, but there were no significant differences. So this is interesting considering that corn and soy fields are fertilized extensively and most of these perennial plantings aren't. So seeing some fertility benefits and no major disadvantages indicates to me that fertility is probably not the main bottleneck for perennial production in the Midwest, which is good news. So in looking at pest control and herbivory, it was useful to look at them together because pest control is sort of top-down predators and parasites, while herbivores are the ones potentially damaging plants. So looking at them together is something that kind of makes sense. So in this plot, you can see in red the insect, all the insects that were classified by their trophic function as herbivores, and then in blue all the ones that were classified as pest controllers, i.e. parasites, predators, etc. And so if we look at the number of species, we can see that in the perennial plots and in hay, there were often more of both compared to corn and soy. So more herbivores and more predators and parasites. And if we look at the number of individuals, the same is true for the herbivores, but for the predators, it wasn't significant. And this does agree with literature, which shows that when you have systems that aren't primarily controlled by pesticides, you get more of everything, i.e. you have more things eating plants, but you also have more things eating the things that are eating plants. Looking at pollination, we only really saw a difference between the perennials and the corn for the number of pollinating species, and no significant differences for the number of pollinating individuals. Like I said, this wasn't really a measurement of the direct service, so like pollination visits or fruit set from pollination. but just a kind of proxy of the potential supply of those services. And there weren't huge differences there except for between the perennials and the corn. I also wanted to look at food production and income from these perennial polyculture enterprises. Like I mentioned, many of them are young and about half of them weren't producing at all yet. So just take that with a grain of salt. But I'll just show you a bit of those results. So the food production here is, I'm comparing the perennials to corn and soy in those same counties, just average production from those counties. And this is just from the oldest half of the farms. So I didn't include the ones that were really young or not producing at all. But still, you can see that the yields in edible pounds per acre or calories per acre are much, much lower than soy and corn yields, which is, you know, perhaps not unexpected. As we know, a lot of corn and soy isn't really used for human food anyways. It's used for biofuels and animal feed, whereas on these perennial polyculture farms, all of the food being produced is really for people to eat. And some of the variety of foods are quite interesting. So people were producing fruit, specialty, things that are more medicinal, staples, which are nuts or things of high amounts of protein or starch, fats, vegetables, and livestock. And you can see that generally with the age of the farm, I sort of organize the farms by age. As you go from left to right, the amount of food being produced generally goes up with age, which makes sense. And there are some really nutritionally dense foods being produced that don't weigh a lot, but they have a lot of calories packed in there. For example, nuts and meat, things like that. And so, yeah, and obviously 5 out of the 14 farms weren't yielding at all yet. Just looking at the time, okay. And this is a plot just to give you a sense of income from these enterprises. This is for 2017, so it is out of date because I had to collect the data from the year before I actually visited the farms. So I expect that this would have changed by now, potentially significantly, since a lot of these farms were just kind of 3-4 years old and getting into production. But nonetheless, good to see this data. You can see that off-farm income was important for almost all of the farms. The actual income from the perennial enterprises is these little orange bars, so not a lot of income for most people. But you know, for some of the farmers, these enterprises were not really financially important. They were more like side projects. They were commercial, but not make or break. Whereas for other people, especially a few of the younger farmers, they were investments that were expected to pay off in the coming years that were sort of just still young. So to summarize here, this is a little bit of a busy plot, but I just wanted to give you guys a summary. So this is a response ratio, so of the perennial versus the comparator plots. So if there's a dot above the line, that kind of means that there's some benefit there, or there's a, or that the perennial plot is providing something that we're interested in, and the little dots, ticks, and stars above the line shows this whether those are statistically significant. So you can see that for categories around biodiversity in red, some of the soil fertility things in green, other ecosystem functions in teal, there are some significant benefits. And for food production, it's much lower calorically and by weight. What can we say about this to summarize? We're seeing that these perennial polycultures in the US Midwest are delivering some biodiversity and functional benefits, even a short time after transition, remembering that only 2 of these farms were mature, and that food production is low but providing diverse nutrients, and that food production and plant diversity are increasing with the age of the farm. I think that even though these farm properties aren't very lucrative or high yielding yet, some producers are finding viable pathways to sustain and expand these perennial polyculture enterprises, and they're developing specialized knowledge in doing so. I think the development of perennial crops and expansion into existing cropland of these kinds of systems does hold some unique opportunities for both the environment and for food security. Basically, the ability to supply very nutritionally dense food while being amenable to growing with permanent ground cover or even polyculture like we saw here. So these opportunities depend on farmers' ability to undertake and sustain these transitions. And you know, they're subject to a lot of context-specific policies and politics in their locations. So I do hope that these findings are helpful in contributing to the literature about the role that agroforestry can play in pathways to sustainable agriculture. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people have, I think, after Omar speaks. And just finally, I wanted to acknowledge the folks that made this work possible: funding from the ICAGA Foundation, the National Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, in-kind support from Savanna Institute, and definitely my research assistant, Noah, and a bunch of other collaborators and mentors. And with that, I will hand it over to Omar.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna request control here. Okay, so I just want to introduce myself with my camera on briefly. I'm having some lag problems, so I'm going to shut my video off for my presentation. But my name is Omar. I'm a technical service provider with Savanna Institute. My technical background is in agroecology and soil microbiology, and I'm a grazer. I manage my own organic farm in central Iowa in the Des Moines River Valley, where we have some remnant oak savannas that we're reconstructing as multifunctional silvopastures with small ruminants. And we're also planting trees and doing some of these things that we're talking about today in this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and shut my feed off here so I can see myself. Hold on one sec. Anyway, I don't know if it's going to let me shut it off, but we'll just see if I lag or not. So we're just going to, I'd like to share with you a project that I'm actively working on with an institutional client. As Katie mentioned, it's a land trust with multiple stakeholders that just acquired this 1,600 acre parcel in the driftless area of Wisconsin. The client objectives are native biodiversity, climate resilience, and producing intact communities. So what that means to me is that it translates really well to agroforestry, to be able to produce wildlife habitat, integrate perennials, get immediate cover on the ground, reduce soil disturbance. But the wrench in this design is that the long-term goal for this entire site is full reforestation. But the limiting factor with this client is that there's a lack of labor and financial resources at this time. So the plan is to use agroforestry as a tool to generate revenue and also as a stepping stone to reforestation, so that there's a succession plan where we're using savanna as a means to get to forest. And just to clarify what savanna is, it's anywhere from 50 to 10% canopy cover. with large standard trees. In the Midwest, that would historically have been oaks and hickories, and occasionally walnuts. But if we're thinking about it from a reconstructionist standpoint, we can look at those trees to be multifunctional trees, depending on the objective. So if the objective is to generate revenue, we could use those trees as fruit and nut trees. If it's to produce tree fodder, which is feed for livestock, we can look at more non-conventional trees like mulberries and locusts to produce high protein for tree fodder, where you would come in and shred that tree, or graze it, or coppice or pollard it, which are the technical terms for cutting above the root collar or cutting it at chest height and resprouting with intention to use it as a livestock feed. So we're using the historical context of this property, which is savanna and forest, to inform the agroforestry design. I'm looking at it from two management areas that are currently fragmented in the middle by row crops, and the left light blue area is predominantly row crops and continuous grazing, and then the purple area is degraded savanna and forest with some row cropping. And so we're just going to jump right in here. So the goal is immediate protection, because a lot of this property is severely degraded, as I mentioned. The row crop acres have really low organic matter. There's significant erosion. And as I mentioned, the goal long-term is reforestation. So I want to be able to connect this northeast parcel to the west parcel. The northeast parcel, it's intended to be fully forested as soon as possible. And then the west parcel, we're going to do a long-term succession plan, and to be able to have wildlife move between these systems from forest to savanna to grassland. We're thinking that a transitional zone that's a riparian buffer along this river would be really well suited to be able to tie into the ravines, which we're going to manage as forest. And what I'm saying about the ravines are like right in here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I move forward in the presentation. But immediate coverage, transitioning this corridor into hay ground just to get grasses on the ground and convert those row crop acres, with the intention of eventually turning this entire corridor into a riparian buffer. And then these two areas that are highlighted with darker colors is being proposed as the nursery for the tree nursery for the site, so that we can actually grow the trees that we want to plant on this site in-house, rather than sourcing that seed and genetic material offsite, because there are some really nice standard trees and good solid genetics on the site for native trees that we can propagate in these nurseries. And the ideal spot for a nursery is right there next to a water source, where we could use something like a Kifco reel, which is a hose that's has a solar powered pump that we could be pumping water out into that nursery. And it's an ideal spot to establish a nursery because it's row crops right now, so it's a blank canvas. Just to make sure, looking at some of my notes here, make sure I've got everything covered. So yeah, moving right into expansion into perennials. So this star area here, it's being proposed that we implement an edible forest. What I mean by that is using the architecture of a forest, but being intentional about the species that we're planting to produce food crops. So as an example of a nucleus, which is a conserved species list or design that you would replicate across that site, like in an alley cropping system. Example of that could be chestnut trees spaced every 20 feet with pawpaws every 10 feet in the understory of that chestnut tree, because they're a mid-story tree that is shade tolerant and actually prefers to be in shade. And then next to that would be berry shrubby plants like honeyberries or raspberries, and underneath that understory it could be medicinal herbs and so on. And then here, moving along this edge here, is a 30 to 60 foot variable width prairie establishment site as a corridor. And we're doing that to immediately protect those slopes. So a lot of those are 20% or greater, and there's significant erosion on those slopes. And there's potential to generate revenue with that through the Conservation Reserve Program 43 prairie strips, which requires natives and with a minimum species counts of grasses and forbs at 30 species. So being able to protect that immediately and then generate revenue from that is appealing to this client. And then also these two sites here being planted to prairie to produce seed as a revenue source. So as I mentioned, it is currently being row cropped by a long-standing tenant that's been farming this for I think over 20 years at this point. And he also has cattle, and he's been continuously grazing this because, as you can see, it's pretty wild, and fencing it in is not something that's really feasible. So he just lets them out and grazes that at his leisure. So the savanna is really degraded, and the stream is also super degraded right now. And I'll talk a little bit about the strategy for mitigating that, but also keeping the animals on the land to be able to maintain the openness of the savanna the way it is right now. But I'm going to backpedal a little bit about the row crops. The reason we're doing this in a corridor like this is to maintain the ability for the row crop farmer to continue farming this, because that is a revenue stream for this client, that land rent that farmer is renting to be able to produce those row crop acres. So this design keeps that in mind. So as we expand with further perennial integration for turning this into a silvopasture, we want to be cognizant of that row crop equipment. So that's 30 feet. And so every time we expand this with more grass, these edges can be trees or they can not be trees depending on what the client wants to do. But we're doing immediate cover with grasses and able to, with the intention of planting trees in a silvopasture savanna type architecture. So as we continue to expand, it maintains the conduciveness to the row crop equipment. So he can come down in here and not really have to turn his equipment very much or have it be in his way. And this is also really nice to have this set up for maintaining trees that are being established with other equipment like ATVs and smaller tractors and trailers for getting brush off the site. And I'll talk a little bit more about the usefulness of this corridor on the edge for livestock movement when I talk about the paddock design. So the nice thing about having a system like this where we implement it slowly is we have these individual parcels or management areas that we can integrate whenever the client is ready to do that. And we have specific management areas now that have been implemented at whatever stage they want to do that. If that's 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that can be determined down the road. And now we have a nice spine on the top of this upland that is really conducive to annual production, or it could be for putting another tree nursery or serve as an access point for a U-pick operation, processing facility, and so on, because it has fantastic access right here to the main road. And so with that, we're managing this savanna with grazing, because if we remove the grazing animals, a lot of the classical invasive species will encroach on that savanna. So that's honeysuckle and autumn olive and multiflora rose and things that'll choke out an understory. But we want to manage this with grazing animals, but do it through regenerative grazing, where the ravines here are going to be managed as forests that connect to this riparian buffer, which connects to this forest that'll be fully reforested. And then there's a flow path here from this forest into these grassland uplands where livestock can move along this edge and access these paddocks strategically, and then come back along this corridor, access this paddock, and so on. And the nice thing about having this laneway is we can now access the entire property without having to damage anything on the interior, or be able to strategically access interior plots through this outside network that we're able to move livestock between this field and over here and into this area as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what the site is right now and why we want to change that. So typically, this is a really common scene in the Midwest where we have woods and then pasture, and there's a hard edge there. And that's not really what we want to see for increasing biodiversity and wildlife movement and just capitalizing on, yeah, that space. It's not using this space very well. So we want to feather that edge or produce an edge that blends. And sorry, for some reason, my slide deck is not looking the way it's supposed to look here, but I think you get the general idea. So we want to produce an edge that blends on this site. So from the grassland to the woods, we want to be able to integrate fruit and nut trees and mid-story trees and shrubs and pasture. And so what I coined this is for wildlife to be able to ride that gradient, because now you have a habitat structure for pretty much any kind of species that you're hoping to attract, so from grassland birds to forest birds to birds that prefer shrubs. And then you have that gradient where you're having different species of trees capitalize on their different niches. And now when we're thinking about turning this savanna into a forest, is we can start filling in these gaps over time with trees that can choke out the understory, but in the meanwhile profiting from the agroforestry system as it transitions into a forest. So you saw how wild the land was, and fencing it in would be insane, else from a financial standpoint, from a labor standpoint. And as I mentioned on my first slide, labor is really limited, so we have to be creative about how we think about labor, especially from a grazing perspective, because it's not realistic to put fence in at the scale that it needs to be put in to be able to manage animals regeneratively on this property. So this is a technology I want to introduce called virtual fencing. It's a technology that was invented in 1998 by a company in Norway called NoFence. There's multiple other companies out there, but as a user of that technology on my own farm, I can say confidently that this is the one collar that I think far surpasses the tech and the reliance or reliability that, based when compared to other collars. So it doesn't require a physical fence to be buried. It's actually GPS based, and it's solar powered with a rechargeable lithium ion battery on the inside. And the way that it works is you put the collar on the animal, and those chains rest on direct contact on the neck. And as they approach the virtual boundary, they get an auditory cue. And that cue is an escalating octave. So it goes boop, 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 boop. And then if they don't respect that last tone, it'll give them an electrical pulse, which is 3 kilovolts. But if you have any grazers in the audience, we know that's really modest. I feel like grazers in the US like to brag on how hot their fences are. And I would say in general, they're at least 10 kilovolts, the polywire and the electric netting. So 3 kilovolts is really modest. And the reason it's so effective is because we have that direct contact along the neckline. And it takes about a week to train the animals to this virtual boundary. The way that you do that is you have your physical fence, and then you set the virtual boundary in from that physical fence, and they associate that physical fence with the virtual shock. And I'm using this on my farm right now, and I love it. As I mentioned, I'm reconstructing really wild territory with this technology, and the convenience of having it on your phone is really spectacular. And you can move paddocks on the fly, and it's a huge labor saving tool. So I get that the question of cost a lot, and which is relevant to this client, obviously, because finances and labor are limited. So just some quick back of the envelope calculations. For a cow collar, it's $300 per collar. For a small ruminant collar for goats and sheep, it's $200 a collar, and there's a $60 per collar per year subscription cost. Just kind of like we think about our cell phones. That's how this works. It's based on cell towers. There's redundancy built in and satellites as well. So for 100 cows, that'd be $30,000 or $3,300 annually for the subscription. And we think about labor for moving fence at a conservative estimate of 20 hours per week at $15 an hour. That's roughly $15K annually to do the moves. You could subtract that annual subscription cost from that, and you have roughly $12,000 of labor that you can reinvest in the property to manage tree plantings or conduct prescribed burns, check on animal welfare, process animals, that sort of thing. So for this particular property, that translates to roughly 13 miles of potential perimeter fencing. So if we think of that conservatively, that's $2 to $20 per foot, or anywhere upward to $1.3 million of fencing to fence just the perimeter. That doesn't include any of the interior fence to be able to move them daily. Doesn't include installation cost. So virtual fencing becomes really appealing for this particular project. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our presenters there. Fascinating on both ends. I have so many questions, but we have one from the audience here we're going to get to. Eric is asking, how are they planning to harvest the nursery seeds from those two areas in the southwest of Omar's, your presentation farm?
So we're thinking bulk, just bulk seed. So just you can do that with a combine harvester.
Great. If there's any other questions, please feel to ask away. I have an interesting question that I've always been curious about is how do you quantify value of your ecosystem services from these systems? Is there a way to place a monetary value to the actual ecosystem service there? And is there value anywhere to be gained from it? Money coming in from government, NRCS, et cetera, et cetera.
Maayan, you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, I can take first stab, Omar. I think it really just depends on which one. So I mean, the kinds of programs that NRCS runs are a type of payment for ecosystem service program. So they'll pay you to install buffers or Savanna, et cetera. And that's essentially them paying you for water quality and ecosystem service. Other ones are, a bit less, they don't have a market or a buyer yet, as it were. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It kind of depends on your philosophical outlook on life, whether these are things that should be really robustly quantified and then a market created for them, whether it's from the government being the buyer or some sort of open market scheme. Or are these things that we know are public goods and we hold to be valuable for a variety of reasons, which are not just dependent on whether we're able to sell them or not. So I think there's been a lot of debate in the ecosystem services literature kind of on this point, and whether, some people say if you monetize something and something else can replace it, then suddenly that thing has no value. Whereas if we are maintaining systems more generally, maybe with a government buyer of a general suite of practices which we know are beneficial more holistically, then we're maintaining things kind of over the long term and not just because they happen to be saleable at this point.
I think there's also, from a grazer or producer standpoint, there's multiple institutions that are incentivizing systems that produce food in a regenerative way. And one immediate example is Audubon has their grassland bird ranching initiative where there's an incentive to produce meat in a regenerative way with wildlife habitat integrated. And I think there's more of a push from processing and packing facilities to have those type of marks on regeneratively raised meats. So in other words, I think some of those structures are coming from private incentives rather than government incentives right now, because it is definitely a moving target because it's so hard to measure. But me personally, I think wildlife metrics and water quality are great metrics, versus carbon sequestration is such a complicated target that's variable spatially and temporally, and also really expensive to measure. So I think something that like what Audubon is doing is really fantastic, because it's based on wildlife metrics and just perennial cover too.
Sure. Very interesting. Omar, I've got a question for you. As someone who's, ranched for sheep and goats, never really cattle outside of fencing and pasture before. How many times have you had that system fail? And you've had to actually go and round up an animal outside of that software?
The virtual fencing?
Yeah.
Well, never.
Wow.
The adage is, if water can get through the fence, a goat can get through it. So the cool thing about this is that there's no water that can move through the fence because it's all virtual. But I think the main issue is the training part. Like I had animals like that I've had for a long time be totally confused because I was learning the system as well. There's a learning curve to getting them trained to the collars. And I thought some of my alpha animals were ready for it and they were totally confused and broke through the barrier. The cool thing about it is once they break through the barrier, they get 3 shocks, and if they don't respect that, they're just out in the open, but they're GPS located, so you know exactly where they're at. So I can go out and observe that animal, but the technology works because it leans on herd behavior. So if you have one animal that gets spooked and moves out of the fence boundary, they might be out of the boundary for a little while, but they'll come right back in and be with the herd. So I'd say the main problems has been with me, not with the actual technology.
That's a very good adage right there. I've got a question for you, Maayan. We're gonna have like 2 minutes to answer this, and then we're gonna go to our next slide. So just prep you for that. Can you explain young agroforestry systems had higher bird diversity than mature systems? Also, could silvopasture systems compete with calorie production of corn, beans in light of calorie value of animals? That's a pretty quick, loaded, it's a big question for 2 minutes.
Sorry, I might have missed the last part of that. The first part, no, so the older perennials had higher bird diversity than the younger perennials. So was that clear?
That's right.
Yeah.
And then the second part of the question was, can silvopasture systems compete with calorie production of corn and beans in light of calorie value needs of animals?
I don't think they can, considering how just incredibly, I don't know, impressive the industrialized agricultural system is. It's finely tuned machine until it collapses, right? So
Sure.
I don't think it can compete calorie to calorie, but in terms of the nutritional quality and actual availability to people of this food, I think it can compete. And we're going to see in the coming years if some of these systems become a bit more commercially viable and kind of some more just more intensive food production.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that circles back to what you were saying earlier on values too in the systems that we're developing and farming. When ecosystem services like the industrial system versus this polycultural diverse system. Last slide we have for you today. Thank you for joining us. Barbara, if you would like to give a little pitch for the perennial gathering, if I can get the screen to switch over. There we go.
Yes, thank you, Josh. So first, I want to thank you all for joining us today and say that there were a lot of slides with a lot of information, and this webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to go through those again, take your time, pause if you need to. So keep an eye out for that. We'll send out an email with that information and a link to the YouTube page. But I wanted to mention that this upcoming week, so next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the 7th to the 9th, we're hosting our 2022 Perennial Farm Gathering. It's an yearly event that the Savanna Institute has been hosting for now about I think 8 years, which started in a kitchen with a few farmers, perennial farmers, interested in how we can spread this knowledge and adoption. And it has grown now to pretty big event that we've been hosting virtually over the past couple of years because of COVID. But this year we are lucky enough to have a couple of really great speakers coming, including the director of the Union of Concerned Scientists, their Food and Environmental Program, Samantha Bosco from Cornell University, and then the author of Agroforestry, Tending to Trees for Profit Woodland Ecology, which is about coppicing. We're going to be talking about land access, coppicing for agroforestry, carbon sequestration, careers in agroforestry, design for conservation and propagation. And because we're getting so close to the event and we really want as many people as possible to be able to come, we want to share with you this free registration code. So if you register with the code PFG 2022 VIP, you'll be able to cover your entire registration cost. This is for you to continue learning about agroforestry and to be part of this great community, but also for you to share with others which you think would be interested and might want to join us through 3 days of virtual learning about agroforestry. So you can register on our website at savannahninstitute.org/perennial farm gathering. And if you have any question, you can reach out to us and we'll share this information with you again. But again, great seeing you all today. Thanks for joining us for this fourth iteration of our perennial agroforestry series. We're going to be meeting again in March. This time, I think we're going to be talking specifically about soil health, and we hope you're going to be joining us.
Thank you, Barbara, for that. And thank you, Maayan and Omar, for presenting today. And thank you, everyone, for logging in, and we will see you next time.